This program is proudly brought to you by the French American Heritage Foundation of Minnesota. We are 501c3 foundation.
Good evening, everybody. Bonjour. I am the president of the French American Heritage Foundation, and we are a bunch of people that love history. We're big history buffs and history people, so we decided that let's do something about the French American heritage in Minnesota. So we're a small organization, but we do things involving French and French American heritage. Now the Alliance is a big organization. They do all kinds of stuff. They do a wide variety of things involving French culture and language and whatnot. But every so often we get together and we do an event together. And I worked with Ibu to help put this event on. And it's usually, when we get involved, it's going to be focused something on history. And tonight I'm really excited to be able to introduce our speaker. His name is Joseph Amato. And he's going to give a talk tonight and talk a little bit about this idea of ways that we become French. And I'm really looking forward to what he's going to say. I'm real curious how he's going to present this. But Joe is a noted teacher, public speaker, scholar, and he's an author of over 20 books. At this table over to my right are some of his books. I don't know if that's all of his books. Take a peek if you're interested, buy a book. We also have some books for sale, the Heritage Foundation. We don't have a lot of money, and one of the ways that we do raise money is we have written 3 books involving French heritage in Minnesota. Those books are also for sale. They're over on the right if you're interested. But after, we're going to have some wine and cheese, and we can talk, and you can browse books. But let me get back to introducing Joe. Joe is he's got a bachelor's in history from the University of Michigan. He graduated there in 1960. Then he went to the University de Laval in Quebec, where he got a master's degree in history. And then finally, he went to the University of Rochester, where he received his Ph.D. in history. He then went on to teach at Southwest Minnesota State University in Marshall, Minnesota, where he was the founder and chair of the history department. He's an amazing, it's been my privilege and pleasure to have met Joe a few years back, and he's been a supporter of our foundation, and it's just really fun listening to him talk, because his mind is amazing. And I can't wait to hear him talk tonight about the ways that we become friends. So Joe, you want to come up? And
sure, I'm ready to go. Thank you.
You're on. Thank you very much.
Great pleasure to speak to the Carpatho-Rusyn Society. We have 3 Carpatho-Rusyns and counting. I'm just teasing. There's some French-Canadian friends I have, one of Parisot, who's here with his daughter, and of all things, there's a Flamand, will you say it for me? Yeah. Yes, say the name. Flamic, that's it, the Flamic from Ghent, Minnesota, which became highly Belgian, but originally it was the Grand Valais or Grand Pré, and there was a terrific war as the Belgians knew how to count. The French knew many other things. But the Belgians, since the 12th century, had been counting that fertile land in the low country. And there was a famous punch, the most famous punch in Lyon County history, delivered in about 1908, when the priest had the audacity to appoint one more Belgian to the church board, which then meant the French were outnumbered. And the local Frenchmen, because there still was a residual French group there, and if you go to the cemetery, it'll prove it. the Ghent and the Green Valley Cemetery. Well, anyhow, he delivered a punch, and it is the punch heard around Lyon County. It still was echoing when I wrote a book on the Belgians. So anyhow, that was sort of teasing aside. I want to thank Mark. He's been a marvelous introduction. He's almost onto himself a way of becoming French. And this book they put out, in fact, I won't tell the story, but how Mark and I got to meet, is just a wonderful book if you're looking for your French roots in Minnesota or your river roots. If you're French, there's a good chance in depth you're a river rat if you're a North American French. And as we'll hear later, there's a good chance you're also a Metis. If the Indian is not immediately in the background, they run awfully deep in French, Canadian, and Quebec history. So, and in Minnesota history, it's extraordinary, and the Dakotas up into Saskatchewan. So, well, I'm getting carried away. That's a speaking style I have. I'm like those French houses where you have a front, they have a few more kids, and French are very good at that. Better than the Belgians, but not a lot better. I mean, there was a real headlong race between reproductive force. But then you'd add a house, and then you'd add a house, and you'd add a house. And when I talk, I tend to be a little like that. I add a house. It's like, now I know what he's going to talk about, but I open the door and find there's another pantry. But I want to thank Pierre, who made us sing 200 choruses of Alouetta. No, he gave us a ride down. I've been giving talks for 50 years, and my wife and I have never been chauffeured to one before. That was so good, I didn't feel like giving out. I felt like just having Pierre drive us around and tell me more and more. The thing who came deserved your own thanks. I mean, I think it's great. Even the fear of how it was going to snow. I had images of having to go home in a dog sled. We lived down 394, and that could be a real skate. But thanks to everyone. Thanks to the two societies here. The talk will have 3 parts. One will be about learning to read and write French and become entirely at home with the French language. I don't mean entirely at home that my pronunciation is flawless. I don't write poetry in French, but I can read it fairly easily. There is some Flaubert that the passages get too long, but generally I'll pick up and tedious at times, but I will pick up a French book in philosophy and history about as easily as English if I'm trying to start a new subject, and that was a gift. So that's learning French. But there was a second way in midlife, a stunning surprise, which genealogy can hold for you. If you're from a family of bankers, you're bound to find a robber baron, or just a plain robber a couple generations back. Conversely, if you're from a family of robbers, pimps, and prostitutes, you're bound to find a saint 2 or 3 generations back. So genealogy holds surprisingly wonderful things. King one day, scoundrel the next, or king and scoundrel at the same time, and that's not an impossible combination. And I discovered out of the blue, it wasn't out of the blue, it was actually out of the labor and tedium of genealogy, which can be a tedious way where we have to keep going to family picnics and keeping tabs of divorced cousins, especially when they were doing it 12 children at a time in each family. I mean, even visiting the graveyard, you had to go with the tent and stay overnight because you couldn't make it to each of the graves. Well, I'm exaggerating, but yeah, I did run out of flowers one time. So I discovered I was Acadian, and I can't tell you what an historical jolt that is, to be transported to Nova Scotia in 1640 and find that one of your relatives was a lieutenant. He was a farmer, but probably a smart one. He could probably at least count pretty damn well. Ending up with some authority, and then the Great Expulsion of 1755. So those were two reasons. But the third reason will probably will suggest he'll say any damn thing, that guy. But it's about a friend I created for my grandchildren some 30 years or 40 years ago. He came out of my head in a bar in Cottonwood. I'd like to say it was Andy's Pool Hall, but it might have been the new municipal. I don't recall which. But he's a 25-foot giant who's French-Canadian, Indian, but he's also a buffalo. And some deeper inheritance, some deeper. And he is called Buffalo Man. And guess what my next book is on? I'm just getting ready to rewrite the first volumes of the river system, of the days when Minnesota was French, the days when the Red River was French, and the days when the upper Mississippi was French, and frankly, when the world belonged to the rivers. Not the railroads, not the big farms, but it belonged to this collection of diverse people. I mean, they're amazing from literacy to illiteracy. And by the way, there's some Scotch and Irish moved and mixed in the Metis too. So it was just a wonderful group. But we're not here tonight to talk only about my three ways of being French, which I'll get to, and there'll be three parts of the talk. But just to try your brain out, I created some slides, and the basic purpose is to suggest different ways we're all French, or might be French, or could become French, or you'd be so excited by this lecture, you would walk out of here en parlant français tout le temps d'après. And you might just want to be French, or you might be here because your darn husband or mate is French, and you're, well, he goes with you, you go with her, and you're stuck with one another, so you might as well be French for the evening. So here you are. But now I'd like to just show you slides. There's not a real rhyme or reason to them, except to evoke your imagination with images, to suggest the varied ways, or multiple ways, or plethora of ways that you might be French, or you might be more French than you are, or you might just want to become French. Mark is sponsoring tours to Paris right now. I have heard about them. I didn't know that I'd written making France, particularly France, the center, although some French Canadians, the center of my writing. Well, I found out something like I'd written 25 or 20 serious book reviews of aspects of French history, from the history of walking to histories of individuals, to new books on the Metis, one that I just reviewed for the Minnesota Historical called Minnesota History, just out 3 months ago. And I just guess I had 1 foot all the time down the boot, 1 foot all the time in the mud. And so here we go. That's if you're a crusading French and your spiritual patroness, saint is Jeanne d'Arc. the beginning of the great dialectical differentiation of the French and the English, which at points gets pretty hard to tell apart. Something's going to happen now, Ibu. Help me? No, it's fine. I think this is a Cézanne. It's a Cubist painting of the countryside. In one way, when you think of France, you think of the pays or the passage. You also think of elegant loyalty. You think of Versailles. You think of the Hall of Mirrors. You think of sovereignty. You think of waste. You think of the necessity of revolution. You think of a person who dared to say, sounds like he's an American politician, l'État, c'est moi. The state, that's me. This is an image, I think, taken from a newer French movie, but there's a counter theme in a lot of French cinema and writing that looks, as a lot of us do, at the peasant background. When I look at the Carpatho-Rusins, I'm interested in how children would often warm their feet in manure piles when they went from one little dacha to another, or when I'm thinking of my own father's family in Sicily that we go up to visit every so often in the mountains of Sicily. I'll tell a story you might enjoy about them. That family wrote us a letter after World War II. We have three. My cousin, a double first cousin, who's a genealogist. And that's wonderful. Boy, does that save you work. And he has 3 letters sent back to our family in Detroit, roughly the dates 46, 47. If you know anything about Sicily, it was in terrible shape. One of them, in fact, the first one in the family in recent times to have a garden, got it. After 2 years, he and a friend collected scrap iron from Patton shells as they came through our village on the way to bombard Sicily. Palermo. And he collected it and bought his first little garden. But the story I want to tell you, this family was being sued by 2 people, the butcher and the doctor. And they didn't know which one to pay, and they wrote us that in the letter. And the only thing I came up with, the immediate kind of smart aleck thought, thank God they didn't hire a lawyer to figure it out, or they'd owe 3 people. All right, that's a peasant. We all like to find our peasant roots. On the other hand, victory, liberty, in the 1848 revolution, the tricolor, almost like she's the front of a ship, the prow of a ship, bringing us good times, the men with their pitchforks and pistols, but I love the guy who looks like Abraham Lincoln with the top cap. It's the great people's revolution of the year 1848. It was in many ways the beginning of the end of revolution as having good consequences. It was, well, I won't talk about the revolutions of 1848. But after all that French talk, I go, mais non, I'm from Quebec, a French Canadian. I don't speak the language anymore, or I do maybe still. But I sure as heck don't know much about France or care much about France. I'm of a completely different mold or vintage. I have my own terre, I have my own peuple. Et la France peut faire ce qu'elle veut. France can do whatever it wants. N'importe. Now, everyone know where that is? the Chateau Frontenac at Quebec. Just the great boardwalk runs along the Saint Laurent, the St. Lawrence. And it's just beyond the ramparts of the fort that once defended old Quebec. That Wolfe, the British general, climbed up the shore, the steep bank, and defeated Montcalm, in fact, Montcalm died on that battlefield, and that marked North America becoming English or American. But it was goodbye for France with that defeat. Very dramatic battle. In the words of the great English, Massachusetts historian of North America, Francis Parkman, he saw the battle for North America between the French and English as the great American war. Sometimes I think we think the Civil War is the Great War, but with a longer perspective, you could see it was another war, maybe, depends on your point of view. On the other hand, you might say, I'm not French in the Canadian sense or American, North American sense. I'm not French as a French person, but French is my native language, and we belong to a very early colony of France in Africa. Hebrew, I think, was saying Senegal.
Yes.
France had many, many colonies in Africa. This map will give you some feeling for that. As you know, they had colonies in Southeast Asia. Had a little bit to do with the war, we know. There's the Vietnam War. They had some holdings, I believe, but I would hate to take a test on that one. In India, I think there were some French possessions in southern India, but I could be wrong. Maybe the Spanish and Portuguese outdid them on that one. But France was a global power impeding globally, and if they'd had their way, they'd organized Africa different than the British. And there was a real ongoing competition. Now we're getting to the Frenchman that I feel most at home. This is the great author of the 3 volumes of essays in the 16th century, who was trying not to take sides in the Reformation. He tried to stand beyond sides, and his essays are a great mediation between modernity and the classics, the New World, and he, perhaps, as much as anyone, is the emergence of the modern mind, and his prose is near the top. But then there's this other Frenchman, René Descartes. Je pense, I think, donc je suis. I think, therefore I am, one of the great arguments for our own being, that we can prove our own existence by our own thoughts, so we prove it by consciousness. And after we do go through that argument, we prove God by his own nature, the famous ontological argument, and he sets up a lot of modern early continental philosophy, and he happened to be a great mathematician. This man occupies a lot of science, one of the early founders of the calculating machine, and calculus, and worked with the void. But he also was a religious soul, and a dark religious soul. He was terrified, and that's what the little phrase you have there, it's one of his memorable phases. The infinite space, which we laud, we just found 8 planets that we didn't know about that we laud. Pascal had the common sense to say, they scare the poop out of me. I mean, you're only 14 trillion miles away from one of those things, so if you want to start a romance with some new molecular life. I figure it would take you about 59 lifetimes if you were in the world's fastest rocket to get a little closer to him. Okay, then there's Jean-Paul Sartre. If you were young at my age, you had to read Being and Nothingness. It was thick. You also had to read his plays, one of which was called Hell is Others, L'Enfer c'est les autres. And he was an institution of atheism and existentialism unto himself. And he was a dog that had many tails. I don't know what that meant, but that was fun to say that. And this is a fellow I liked a great deal, Emmanuel Mounier. He's a French Catholic personalist. He was in many ways the heart or the fullest voice of the French Catholic Renaissance of the 20th century, which was extraordinary in literature, but also in philosophy. Extraordinary. So you might be French by his thought alone. You might say, je suis personnaliste. Je suis un enfant de Emmanuel Mounier. So it goes. The Arc of Triumph. Well, it's a great place to hang out for 4 hours, drink coffee, and think your deepest thoughts. Or pretend you're thinking your deepest thoughts, but this is the left bank. The Café de Flore, the Café of the Flower, and more than one famous French writer hung around on the left bank. This is the beginning of hanging around. The French are, in many ways, the beginners of Bohemia. So if you want to go on kind of the left side of reality a little bit, make sure you got a rich father, though, it'll help you. And you don't necessarily need to be an original artist, because the great majority are followers of original artists. But this is a little later. It's probably 2 generations later after Bohemia was in its fuller form. And this is the Moulin Rouge of Latrec, associated with absinthe and drug-taking, the arts, marvelous, and the, what is it, the Folie Berger, or the Berger Folier, or it's a New Living song. Here's Bohemia kind of catching up with itself. So you could go there. There's a Woody Allen movie that kind of plays on that. I can't think of the name of it. He's in a taxi and rides all over Paris.
Midnight in Paris.
What?
Midnight in Paris.
Okay. A lot of artists gathered. You could say you're French because you're cosmopolitan. Russian, Polish, Slavic thinkers, Italian thinkers, people fleeing from fascism, people fleeing different tyrannies, people trying to catch up with their times, kind of sick of their village, even if their village was Leningrad, went to Paris. Dostoevsky had to walk on those streets, and Paris was a nest for intellectuals and painters. It often was the center of arts. There's Gertrude Stein, one of the Americans. I just put that one poem down from her. Gertrude Stein was friends with Ezra Pound. Anybody who thought they had a thought visited Gertrude Stein. I don't know if she really had a thought, But if you thought you had a thought, you should visit Gertrude Stein. That's the young Hemmingway, who never lacked lip for his writing ship. He sailed along with short sentences. But once in a while he sloshed into Italy, and then he sloshed into Spain, and even bullfighting before he ended up in Cuba and Florida. I won't tell you more, but he was a Frenchophile. Now this is uptown going downtown, or what Jacqueline Kennedy gets out of a school. She's got a great last name, Bouvier. And she comes and literally Frenchifies herself, probably in at least as much as 2 years, which made her in many ways the style of American life for some people. This is Angela Davis, the great radical from Berkeley, whose voice defined revolution for many, many West Coasters in particular, but even the rest of the nation, and the radicalism that came out of the late 60s into the 70s. She was truly a spokeswoman. All that says is that France is a fountain for a lot of things. Anyone want to throw an egg or say anything at this point? I'll say, it's a say. You get the idea. There are many ways to be French, and if I could just add, you can say you're French a lot of ways too. You can stand up and say, Je suis français, or française. On the other hand, you say, ma grand-mère m'a dit, peut-être, je suis français. My grandmother told me, perhaps I'm French. Sort of like that priest who kept saying, to the parishioners at the end of each thing, usually involved, you should give more money or you should repent. And it was, he would end each phrase with, Je ne qu'une porte en arrière. I've got no back door. What I'm saying to you is totally true. It's up front. Je ne qu'une porte en arrière. That was one of the favorite phrases I learned. I love that. And then a little Frenchman at the back who could be a little bit of a Descartes who doubted all he could doubt. He says, peut-être un petit quiché, maybe a little milk chute or mail chute in the back. Arrière-pensée. Okay. You've heard, and I'm just skipping that, there's just a tremendous number of ways to say you're French. By association, insinuation, or both your parents, or you're out of a French orphanage. I mean, it's extraordinary the number of ways you could come to claiming that as part of your ethnicity, or maybe not even your ethnicity, but your identity. After all, ethnicities and identities aren't fixed things in stone that you find right inside yourself. They're also instruments you learn to play. Rarely is a person anything entirely of what they say they are. Most all of us are malleable, manipulable, and manipulating, and we frequently will say what's to our advantage or what's our curiosity for a shorter time. But at least let me say, I don't take identities to be rocks. I agree with Sartre on that. That's what he called bad faith, when you could say, I'm a robber, therefore you can feel justified in robbing everybody you wanted for the rest of your life. I can't help it, I am a robber. And a lot of identities work that way. They're kind of pickpockets. I won't get further into that, but if you start to think about political correctness and official identities, you might pick up on that. Okay, now, I was only 20-some and taught high school a couple of years. And I was very interested in theology. For some reason, I had Levain in mind. But at that time, the draft was just heating up in Vietnam, and I was told, and I didn't think I would obey very well. I was rather scared of the Army, not so much I'd be shot by an enemy, but I'd be shot by my drill sergeant. Obedience was never, I wasn't disobedient, but then I wasn't quite obedient either, and it was never my thing. So I decided I had to get a higher degree, so more history. Encore l'histoire, toujours l'histoire. So, Laval, they would help me perfect my French. I could already read it some. And they get me in shape, and I took up having a master's degree and I lived right on the plain. I used to study on the plains of Abraham. I literally studied there, and the St. Lawrence or Saint Laurent connected through the Great Lakes to the Rivière Détroit, or Detroit, where I was brought up. I was in contact with Canada across the river for a lot of reasons. And there was a kind of a blood flow then, and Detroit, of course, is in-depth French. Not just by name, by people, learning, education, discoverers, the whole thing. So I decided I'd go to Quebec. I took it up, and I had history. I had wonderful courses. Some of them were, I thought, entirely bizarre. But it was the French curriculum. I had like, one semester I had 16 classes, I think. But then there'd only be an exam of 2 of them. But you wouldn't know that till a week before. And it would go on everything from costumes to traditional French history to Prussia. I mean, it was wonderful. The smorgasbord of the whole thing. But I also confess it was way beyond me, but I had the wonderful 2 semesters from Luc Lacrossière, who is there's a couple that are earlier that are greater than he, but he is, maybe, I'm going to make him for the purpose of this talk, Luc Lacrossière, the 3rd father of French-Canadian folklore. And French myths, French stories, French jokes, and French songs. Luc Lacrossière was very good at Acadian dance. But Luc introduced me to something I was very interested in anyhow, as somewhat an emerging religious thinker. I was very interested in how we live by myths and stories. And in his case, I met people who believed they'd seen a bateau fantôme. Literally met him. I came up after the guy's lecture. I said, that was marvelous. That was entertaining. People could even believe that you believe in these phantom ships. He said, mais monsieur, je crois. And so I was stunned. He believed in phantom ships. And I learned stories about people getting caught by fathers, daughters getting caught by fathers in the bow, fleeing, but taking some pancakes with them, running a long way. Finally, the father catches up with him at a stream that he's fallen into trying to cross, and the pancakes come out. The father concludes this man even defecates pancakes. You better marry him. I mean, I realize it's a bit vulgar, but those are the wonderful stories I heard, and they're very close to my friend Rabelais, who in many ways, an Acadian mind in the 17th century, that's 1600s, was for all purposes a French mind, a French peasant mind, and the Rabelaisian stories, some of which go back to Egypt, they're very old. The Nova Scotian stories, or the myths of Canada, took me back. To this day, my wife and I have a drawing I picked up, a sketch that I picked up later by a French-Canadian artist, and it's a it's a print, an original print, there's only so many of them, of a canot volant. Who knows what a canot volant is? A flying canoe. And when you worked up in the Laurentides, you'd get very lonely to see your family or your belle. And you wanted to get home. Well, how would you get home from that's always been a problem for a lumberjack. How do you get home in the winter? Well, a guy comes by who happens to be the devil. And he gives you a ride in the canoe. Of course, you just paid your soul for that one canoe trip. But the devil himself has to be careful, because it's paddling. He were to accidentally cross over a church, and particularly a crucifix that crowns a church, the canoe would capsize, he'd go out too. Now, if you like things like that, you'd love the folklore I had. Especially somebody come and say, I'd read all these stories about who's a werewolf, a loup-garou. And somebody would say, I saw my brother-in-law, you never liked him anyhow, he's a loup-garou, he's a werewolf. And he was driving somebody else's Chevrolet. And this was the French peasant countryside. Canada, I'm going to break the news to you, was not the Montreal elite who thought they were from Paris, the exclusive parts. 99.9% paysan, peasant. D'apertu. They were in the little communities. The big figure was le prêtre, the priest. You had the oral culture, you had the religious culture, and you had your little community. Does that qualify to be a peasant? I'd say I think I just defined a peasant for Europe, Germany, Italy, Sicily. Very local, very autonomous, but maybe a priest is there. Maybe. So I was immersed in a French language. I wrote a dissertation on a fellow, I won't talk about him, called Joseph de Maistre. He was the greatest reactionary in all of European history. I didn't say conservative. I said reactionary. He was a Frenchman from Savoy, an aristocrat, and he hated the revolution, and he ended up ambassador to Russia. I wrote my dissertation, particularly as a book he wrote called The Evenings of St. Petersburg. And after they finally got rid of Napoleon, and he'd come back. They kept saying the utopians were getting visions, we should have a perfect society, blah, blah, blah. And Joseph de Maistre said, vous voulez bâtir, you want to build, et le sol se tremble encore. You want to build, but the soil is still shaking. Le sol se tremble encore. It was beautifully said. Even if it's false, it was beautifully said. I entered into this French thing, and eventually a lot of the books I worked with were French, and I wrote my dissertation on French Catholic personalism, and I worked on the Thomist, Jacques Maritain, and more on the fellow I mentioned before, Emmanuel Mounier. I wrote on the famous French journal, which was the Catholic counterpoint of Le Temps Moderne, the Sartre's journal. I wrote on L'Esprit, the Spirit. It had such wonderful people, many Protestant thinkers, and the great Orthodox thinker who was always a favorite of mine, Nicholas Berdyaev. I don't know if any of you have heard of Nicholas Berdyaev. Well, now you've heard about him. Go study Nicholas Berdyaev. Okay. Now, that's part two. Well, anyhow, I become a teacher. We're married. We're living for a small time, and my wife, then 4 children. I thought we were only going to be in Minnesota for 2 years. We started to rival the Belgians and the French in propagating, so we thought maybe we'll make southwestern Minnesota Carpatho-Rusin and Sicilian. But I was always reading French stuff. I would often structure things. And I must say, I even had gone for a year of graduate study at UCLA, and the main professor was one of the great historians of France, Eugene Weber. And Weber had written a marvelous book. It's a defining book called Frenchmen in the Peasants. And it deals with the very recent total transformation of peasants into Frenchmen by such things as schools, visits from the cousin, don't forget the draft. Up comes the railroad or the transportation, and up come the markets. And for Eugene Weber, that's recent. So I was deep into this. I knew Eugene, he and I corresponded. But something extraordinary happened. I was teaching a lot of local and regional history. I believe that social scientists and historians and scientists owed the area where they taught understanding and should do some representation for the area where they work. They didn't have a right to come out onto the plains of Minnesota and preach New York or Los Angeles. I found something kind of gaudy, insulting, and just simply kind of petty snobism. It didn't amount to much. They never could be at home because there was always a movie showing in the Twin Cities. And then if they lived in the Twin Cities, then they'd have to go further east. Okay, you got the drift. And so we were very interested in that. So I even got interested in the history of my own family. I wrote an essay, which I think, I don't know if Ibu has up, but we'll maybe get up, called Parents and Grandparents Were All Migrants and Immigrants. I was already preaching being of mixed background is good. I was also tending to line up against purists who treated their ethnicity like it was a bloodline. I'm pure. I even had a friend that tended to carry his Polishness, I thought, to the point. It got a little beyond me. Much less some of the English people, and there are the French too, who are, I didn't like exclusive ethnicities. I liked mongrels and half-breeds. I was already on the way to being a half-breed when, through a wonderful bit of genealogy and a hint that Maine was where we're from, and a little research on my own part, and I discovered on my mother's side, no, the name Boudry was from Massachusetts. And it wasn't Boudry. Guess what it was? Boudreau. Boudreau. And guess how it was spelled? B-O-U-D-R-O-T. This is the original French spelling. There's no E, so there's no sound of the T, and that gives you the O. And I discovered that I was from a 1640 or 1639 Acadian. Well, with the discovery that you're a child, I won't read what that means. I have actually a whole page I was going to read. But to be Acadian means you're part of one of the first modern forced dispersions in all modern history. In 1755, in the fall, the French Acadians, not particularly friends of Quebec, but Catholics, and having good land because they learned to dike the seawater and dike the inland water and get a flow, they were reproducing. Of course, they were intermarrying with Indians. There's never enough women for the French, or the men are caught alone. My favorite story from Quebec was a boat would land at a wharf filled with 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 19-year-olds from the orphanages of Paris. These young women would be on a wharf. They knew how to play the piano. They spoke good French. They'd studied under the nuns, the sisters. Their grammar was perfect. And you know what was supposed to happen to them on the first day of the wharf? A voyageur would be at the wharf looking for someone to accompany him in his canoe or on the outpost. And they'd walk up and down, and I guess maybe if she could bear the smell of them or couldn't. I mean, he might have smelled like beaver oil at best. They'd be married by a priest on the end of the wharf. And here this young Parisian orphan would be stuck, maybe in the seating in the canoe, but better in the bow, it's more stable, but not at the back, of course. And she'd be paddled from Quebec to Montreal, across country, into Duluth, and down the Red River. Talk about, you've heard of being up the river. These girls were down the river. Okay, so I've talked quite a bit about that. So, being Acadian and dispersed, 7,000 were thrown by the British, who wanted their land and didn't frankly trust the Acadians, who kept their guns pretty close to the end. But they didn't trust them, and they wanted their land, and the British were interested in having North America, to put it simply. And the Massachusetts was sort of interested in Maine and Quebec. I mean, there's a deep imperialism in the colonies. Imperialism, yeah, I said it, but there's a deep imperialism rooted in the American states before they become the United States. So England furnished the officers, and Massachusetts furnished the foot soldiers, and all the ships that took the 7,000 out on the autumn seas. 1,200 or maybe some less drowned because they put fragile ships on the worst seas. The rest were scattered literally to the winds and the waves and the currents. My family was lucky enough to go to Massachusetts, so even though they furnished the soldiers, they also furnished doctors, and as wards of the state shipped them out to be kind of supervised, caretook, and hung there. Only with the American Revolution, in which I had now relatives, one who will fight in the American Revolution, because of course the French originally saw the Americans fighting the English as une guerre, a war des fous. A war of fools, and they were delighted. To kill each other off. You can't wish anything better on your enemies than to have a war with each other. But anyhow, in Massachusetts, they began to intermarry, they began to travel, and they went up to one of Massachusetts, because they were poor and often read out of town. That was a common thing they did in the old days when you couldn't afford people to come because you'd have to pay for their firewood. And that firewood was extremely important because they didn't have really good soils, but they could keep you warm with the firewood. They shipped, the Acadians began, intermarried now with lots of English people, almost all English, began to migrate. Some went out into the Midwest, but that was later. Most of them went up to Maine and New York, up into the North Country. My family went deep into Maine, up into the mountains of Maine, and eventually will follow the rivers to Wisconsin. But what you end up with, and that's the only point I want to make, your family history becomes a space capsule to know the history of the United States. It was the thing that preserved your flesh. It preserved the sperm and egg that were going to get together in you across time. It wasn't the state, it wasn't politicians yet, it was your family, and that was the vehicle for crossing time. As an Acadian mixture, I could tell the history of my family, and I preferred the point of view of looking at history. That means the history of Massachusetts and its death, the history of Maine, Massachusetts' colony, the settlement of Michigan, Ohio Valley, Michigan, Wisconsin, and their rivers. French can't seem to get away from those damn rivers. And we're the Wolf River, if you want to know about my grandmother. First, they were up at Stevens Point, at a little place that floods below Stevens Point, and then they ended up. So I became a true, I like to say Metis, in the broad sense of Metis. I now knew myself mixed. I now knew that my family could claim as great a story of victimhood as North America permits. They were the first mass deportation of peoples, and to a degree, I would not say they were enslaved, but they were held in bondage for 15 years by the new colonies. So that would tend to give you, wouldn't it give you a slightly different view of American history? I even learned a lot about Massachusetts debt. And you'd be surprised the powerful role debt plays in history. Okay, I told you that's two. We only got one to go, and I realize we're probably running out of time, right? I'll be about an hour and 5 more minutes. At the bar, Andy's Pool Hall in Cottonwood, there's born this 25-foot giant buffalo man. He's not born out of my brain, he's born into my brain. I have grandchildren. It's a great bedtime story, the events and episodes of Buffalo Man. I mean, you know, he had a hard time having friends with other kids. It would take entire villages to sit on the other side of the teeter-totter to even balance him. Occasionally, when they asked Buffalo Man, of course he's a young kid, when they'd ask Buffalo Man to spin him on a merry-go-round, I'm not sure I'm historically correct. He's now born sort of out of the sky in a long sack, the way an actual buffalo is born, and he hits the ground with a splash. But there he is. He eventually, when he's 3.5, will learn to walk. But when some kids would ask him to push him on the merry-go-round, he was so powerful that the merry-go-round would spin off its axis and fly into the sky 10, 12 miles away, and whole schoolyards would be missing. So he was a terrible playmate. So already he was very, very solitary as a boy, and he's an only child. His mother treats him beautifully, his father treats him beautifully, and they live as assistants, apprentices at Little Rock, which is a trading post just across from Fort Ridgely. No, wrong. Just across from Newell, the city of Newell on the Minnesota. And he goes up and down the river. And of course he gets well known because when the German settlers come and they need land drained, he's a drainage thing. When they need stumps removed, he removes stumps. When an occasional sloppy steamboat driver or the weather goes too dry, runs his steamboat into a snag, which can impale a steamboat. Don't underestimate a snag. Or he runs it onto a sandbar, and there's different kinds of snags. I'd like to talk to you about different ways, if you're a steamboat captain, you could wreck your steamboat and get demoted. You'd end up on the Red River, where they had a lot of steamboats too, and a lot of them hit snags. Most of them blew up, unfortunately, with faulty boilers. And faulty boilers were terrible. They killed a lot of people with shrapnel, blew the whole damn boat apart, and the boat sunk. And there's some terrific steamboat crashes in the Missouri River and the Mississippi, but the Missouri has some of the big ones, and they sink in the silt. So to this day, people are carrying on archaeological digs in the bottom of rivers to excavate steamboats. It's really a wonderful story. All this is before the railroad. We're in Minnesota. No train has crossed the Mississippi yet. The land belongs to the French, it belongs to the Metis, it belongs to the Indians, particularly the Sioux, the southern part, but as you go north, the Chippewa, if you go west, the Mandan, it's a great tribal land, although the Indians have already been forced or have willingly traded away land, and they're getting indebted. So anyhow, Buffalo Man he's so alone. By the way, aside from being a giant body, He's a giant of brain and thought and sensitivity. In fact, he's becoming slightly smaller all the time, rather than bigger. Now, why would a giant become born 25 feet long? He sucked all the cows dry of milk in all the pastures. And of course, the first two phrases he learned is, I'm hungry and I want a drink. So this is no shorty like Paul Bunyan. This is a true Blasian giant. And his nickname is Gar. G-A-R, which is an abbreviation of Gargantua, which is the character of Rabelais' first book. His first name ends up to be, his first and middle name end up to be my own. I wonder why that is. He's a Joseph Antoine. Oh, the family he's from, the family name he carries appropriately, being he's Buffalo, is Boissonette. And that's a French Indian family from, really, Saint Anne de Beaupré, which was a village and a stop along the St. Lawrence as you went up into the Laurentide. So, Buffalo Man is quite a wonder, helping all these farmers, doing these wonderful things. And the most extraordinary is he could move steamboats. Now, he, of course, has all these agents who want to, when he's only 4 or 5 years old, they want to pay him and take him to help steamboats, run mills. I mean, he's like a one-man derrick. But his parents, loving him, and the head of the post, Joseph Laframboise, and the post, as Mark and the people who did the book so well cover, is called, there's a wonderful list of the posts of Minnesota, the French post, stopping off places. The one there is Little Rock, which is the one near New Ulm. So that's the story of Buffalo Man. I'll tell you one last story about him. I'll finish him and I'll be done in 2 minutes, I promise. Because I want to drink some of Ibu's wine. And anyhow, as I told you, Buffalo Man doesn't really walk until he's 3 because he's too busy thinking. He doesn't have extra energy to learn to walk. And anyhow, he's a marvelous creeper. And if you don't believe what a marvelous creeper he is, go out in southwestern Minnesota and see the smaller wetlands, little ponds, potholes. Those are his knee imprints when he crept across the landscape. Also, you might see a few of the golf greens he set up across southwestern Minnesota, because as big as he was, he had to use a sapling for a shaft, and he had to bend over a fairly big plow to form a head of an iron. And for balls, you're probably, what the hell is he making up here? Is he making up a golf story? Yeah, and for balls, he used calves' bladders that he stuffed with feathers. And that produced the famous golf ball of that period, the feathery. Now, Buffalo Man is still creeping, and he gets up one morning the way those creepers will do, or early toddlers, and decides to take off. He creeps to Fort Snelling from roughly New Ulm. You can still see some of the knee prints along the way if you examine the countryside carefully. They're all a lot have been plowed under, you know. They have no reverence for infants' knee prints. And he gets to Fort Snelling, and actually what's going on, and this is truthful, is Minnesota's first fair. It's still a territory. It's about 1850, I want to get my numbers right, about 1851. St. Paul is pretty nascent, and they all speak French, or they're at the Pig's Eye, away the Couchon bar drinking, but St. Paul isn't so big, but Fort Snelling's got a lot of soldiers. In the meantime, at Fort Snelling, everyone who has any produce and things to sell or trade, or maybe wants to buy something, comes to the first state fair. Well, you think that's the end of the story. Not quite. There's a bunch of guys from Wisconsin who are feeling like big shots because they're a state already. They became a state in 1848. They're going to come over and look down their nose at a territory. A bunch of yokels out in the countryside. A bunch of natives. So they do their showing off, and they say, oh, by the way, we'll give you 10-to-1 odds that our 4 best oxen can outpull any pulling combination you can assemble. And you know how this pull works? You have a rope and you kind of go on one side. Well, the betting starts. Meantime, some of the Germans and Frenchmen see the Buffalo Man has creeped into Fort Snelling. And they know he's already done the work of many oxen with farms there. So they say, give us the 10-to-1 odds, and we have an infant, only one of them, who's only 1 oxen or buffalo. And we'll bet you. So all these bets go on. Even the women hunt down in their tightly knitted aprons and pull out coins to bet. So for all purposes, territorial Minnesota puts its money where its mouth is, and the French do, and there's a giant bet. So Buffalo Man is representing Minnesota territory, but all the people who bet. Soldiers at Fort Snelling are holding the money and doing the tabulating, so no one cheats, as they often do in betting. And the Wisconsin people are feeling they're flying high. And they see Buffalo Man, and they still figure he's going to be a flimsy piece of flesh against our 4 tried Wisconsin oxen. All of a sudden, the rope snaps with the 2 sides. Everybody's eyes alert then. They know a real contest is underway. A half hour later, actually, Wisconsin had 6. I missed the number. Half hour later, 4 of Wisconsin's dead oxen are dragged across the line. 2 had heart attacks, 2 died of exhaustion, and 2 were too pooped to pull anymore. And Buffalo Man, boy, creeper, said, oh, you know what? I'm hungry. And they're so happy with all the money that they've made from him. They say you can eat anything you want. So he eats everything. He eats the whole state fair out of house and home. There's not a pie left on a rack, not a muffin left on a plate. He eats it all. Uh-oh. On the way home, he gets a tremendous stomachache. He experiences extraordinary gas, which drives people into their can cellars, in their root cellars. and he still can't pass the gas, so to speak. So he spends all night moaning. And this moaning goes on for 3 days. And no one can sleep. They're going nuts in the valley. Why doesn't that giant gar stop? And he does stop. He relieves himself. And that's the next chapter. I'm not going to tell you a thing about it.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
There's so many visions and inspirations and thoughts in my brain right now. Thank you for inspiring me. I really appreciate it. We're gonna a couple more minutes. We want to talk to you about a couple more things, a couple of events that'll be coming up. I'm going to ask Mary Ellen to come up and just talk a little bit about a masquerade tour that we're going to be sponsoring. Mary Ellen will just give you a couple of bits of information about that.
This year's tour with the foundation is on a bus that we've chartered. We will be going to various sites designed by the French-born architect Emmanuel Masquerade. And it seems to be the year for all celebrations related to Masquerade. He designed the Cathedral in St. Paul, the Church of Saint Louis, King of France, the Basilica in Minneapolis. There are several other churches in the Twin Cities area. There are some homes. There are some other buildings. We'll be spending a good bit of time on the campus of St. Thomas University, where there's a special exhibition. We have lunch there. Do join us. The registration form, as I said, is on the website. We start about 9 in the morning. We'll be done about 3 in the afternoon. We invite you to come.
Ibu wants to come up and talk a little bit about future events for the Alliance. Ibu Won, the events coordinator for the Alliance.
Thank you, Mark. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming out tonight. We are really happy to have this event in collaboration with the French American Foundation and to have Joe Amato tonight. It was a wonderful presentation. And I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about our celebration of Mois de la Francophonie. So every year, about, I would say, 33 million people celebrate Mois de la Francophonie around the world. So it's all French-speaking countries around the world. And each year, Alliance Française select a country to celebrate. And this year, we're doing Senegal, which is where I'm from. I did not pick it, I swear. But so we have a series of events about Senegal, and the opening ceremony will be next Saturday on the 4th. We'll be here at the Alliance. So it's called Ndaje Teranga. So we'll have a historical and cultural presentation about Senegal. We'll have a fashion show, and we'll have some Senegalese food as well. So there's no Senegalese restaurant in the Twin Cities, so this is the only place where you can eat Senegalese food. So, and we have other events as well. You can grab one of these really beautiful carte postale on your way out if you're interested. So hopefully someone will be joining us for those events. And thank you, Mark. That's all I have.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So there are refreshments in the back, some wine, cheese, and grapes. And we really appreciate doing this with the Alliance, historical events. We hope to do these in the future, maybe one a year. And we appreciate all of you coming down here tonight. And so let's have a little wine. Thank you very much.